Hi, welcome to the Interledger Salon. Today you are listening to the fourth iteration of the Interledger Salon, a quarterly panel presented by the Interledger Foundation. Our goal with these curated discussions is to host some of the most exciting people in our ecosystem, who, like us, work with energy and passion to build a more equitable financial world. This will be a space for conversation, sharing, and organizing together. Zhaoji Song will facilitate today's conversation. She's an artist, writer, and researcher based in Berlin. Growing up in China and trained in Europe, she worked on socially relevant and community-specific experiences, often with local networks, NGOs, and local cultural and political institutions, mediated by text, images, games, and performances. She will convene with Anusha Gosalakar, an artist and theater maker, and Sarah Habib, a fintech strategist, to discuss their work, their understanding of money and financial systems, and how that shapes digital financial inclusion.
Hello, my name is Xiaoji. I'm a past grantee of the Future Money Art and Culture Grant at the Interledger Foundation. And today, it is my pleasure to host the Interledger Salon. I'm an artist and researcher currently based in Berlin, working a lot with alternative political memories and imaginaries of the systems we reside in. During my time preparing my project, The Parallel Society, generously supported by the Interledger Foundation, I researched into the emotional and subjective dimensions of financial exclusion, especially how they're entangled with other systems of oppression, and what kind of mechanics it produces for individual decisions that occur during their interaction with the financial systems. I realized during my research and also during my conversation with different practitioners from the Future Money Open Studio at Interledger Summit 2023, as well as my exchanges at the Summit 2024, that everyone, no matter belonging part of the communities that are historically marginalized or even active practitioners in the financial inclusion space, everyone understands and approaches money and financial systems differently, even though they lie in the center of our discussion and work often. Sociologist Elena Esposito says in her book Future of Futures, money expresses the social aspect of the economy. The fact that each exchange refers to all other exchanges and that money has a value only because other members of the society are also ready to accept it. So, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about money and the financial system? Do our answers and relevant discussion change when we start to approach them from a digital realm? And most importantly, how would that influence how we approach digital financial inclusion? So today, I'm delighted to be joined by two guests who have had much reflections on these topics to discuss their past works and their understandings of it, and how this understanding of money and financial system influence digital financial inclusion. Our first guest is Sarah Habib. She's an experienced user researcher and recognized advocate for fintech for good. Sarah combines deep customer research expertise with strong product thinking to inform disruptive and impactful digital financial propositions worldwide. Holding a bachelor degree in history and development studies and a master degree in innovation management, I see Sarah is a strategic thinker with a profound understanding of both the tech world and the social political realm, often working as a bridge in between worlds. Our second guest is Anuja Gosaka. She's a founder of Drama Queen, a documentary theater company in India. Her practice focuses on personal histories, archival absences, and the blurring of hierarchies between the audience and the performer to extend the idea of theater to create audacious work. Iterations around form, process, modes of media, size technologies, and reclaiming of narratives on gender and intimacy are critical to her performance making and pedagogy. Money has also been a central and critical theme in Anuja's work both as artist and grant maker in the past. Anuja has put her long-term reflection on money, value, and the financial system in a lot of her past individual or collective work, such as No More White Money and I Promise the Bearer. So I will invite the guests to say a little more as an introduction to their work that they do, whether in the context of digital financial inclusion or beyond that. Anuja, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to this. I'm very excited to be here. I'm not an expert on anything related to finance or digital finance. At best, I'm a user or a consumer of a digital wallet. and money because I'm an artist and I have very little of it. I just wanted to say that the idea of money in a country like India is quite interesting because we still have a lot of physical money, but it is also a growing economy. So the use of digital wallets in the cities as well as rural India is a big market, for want of a better word. But my relationship to money is very complicated because sometimes I use money by big corporations or arts foundations in order to critique the frameworks within which we operate. So using the money from the big bad people to critique them in subversive ways is how I imagine my relationship to money as an artist. And with digital finance, I'm going to think through that idea during this podcast, to be entirely honest.
And Sarah, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, so you gave me a beautiful and lovely introduction, so thank you very much. And also super excited to be here. So yeah, I work in fintech. I came into fintech because I thought it was one of the ways that we could make the world more equitable. And that's what, for me, finance can do. It's a bridge between people who used to have access to money and power through that, was generally a certain type of person. Now with technology, it's opened it up a lot more to a lot more people. Lots of different things can become accessible: investments, stocks, shares, etc. And the way it's able to not necessarily democratize finance, because there's still barriers within technology, but really, opening up the playing field. Don't want to use too many cliches in one paragraph, but there you are. It can do a lot, and it can do a lot more. And we're just at the starting process of what it can do.
Thank you so much. So, to start with our discussion, can you begin by maybe giving a brief outlining of your interpretation of the term financial inclusion and why does it matter? Anuja, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm trying to think of a really equitable understanding of financial inclusion. The first thing that comes to my mind is that financial inclusion should include communities like women or people of different genders or marginalized genders. And in a country like India, it must include all castes because we have a deep seated caste system, which is in fact hinged on the idea of work. That we were born into families that define the work and therefore the role that we do. So it should include the Dalit communities, which come traditionally at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, and of course women and all genders. And at a very personal level, I would imagine that digital inclusion or financial inclusion, and I'm conflating this idea of financial inclusion with a sort of financial stability or an ability to be able to live a graceful life. And that extends to someone like my mother, who's not an intellectual, who's not an artist. She's working class, she's 77 years old, she worked in a beauty parlor. Feminism to her is a lived experience. For me, feminism is a lived plus an intellectual idea. So to include people for whom being marginalized is their everyday. So I also place myself in a position of privilege. I speak English. I have access to the internet. I have electricity. So to include people like, say, my mother or communities which are very low down the caste system and are not a vote bank in a country like India. So these are the things that I would imagine are communities that should be included in the idea of inclusion in a sort of broad socialist way. But we can complicate it a little bit as we go along, I suppose.
I think it's really brilliant. You already mentioned like basically the intersection of like caste and also gender and gender related politics, and the intersectionality of it is so important to think about other like lack of access and how that influence our access to financial system and the financial world as a whole.
Yeah, exactly the same. But I was going to say, I've really liked your term graceful. It's about bringing grace to everyone, bringing, ease of access to financial tools. It's all about equitable access. And, for individuals and also businesses, small businesses are also marginalized, they're underserved, and one other thing, especially in the UK, is about how access to financial banks, etc., or tools is very much divided between rural and cities. In some parts of the country, and I'm sure this all over the world, and I'm sure in India, if you're in a rural area, it's so hard to get to a bank. If you're in a city, it's hard, but it's easier. You've said everything: education, cultural background, ethnicity, gender. All of these things prevent people from getting equitable access to financial tools that other people take as a norm. And all of these things prevented people from having a graceful existence and have so many headaches because of it. And just about ironing out those headaches, getting rid of them so people can have, economic empowerment, have tools that represent them culturally, understand the language that they speak, all of these things to reduce those inequalities and help them have a better, easier life that other people take for granted.
Also, thank you for mentioning both the rural-urban divide. It was also actually a really big theme of my past work with the Interledger Foundation as well. In China, we have this sort of like a rural-urban dividing system where it's almost like a rest and permit system that exists in EU, but it's actually within China. And that prevents a lot of people to gain access to the infrastructure that exists in the financial system in the urban area. And I think that kind of touched upon some of the question I think we want to maybe dive deeper into discussion sooner. That's also like this idea about fiction, money, and also like discussion related to infrastructure. So I think as an artist and community organizer talking about money and financial system, I myself also, it's impossible to not consider the intangible and the social and political construct that one can either say that money is or money is centered around. And there's a main thing of some of your past work, Anuja. So can you tell us a bit more about your project, I Promise the Bearer? And I think it would be quite central to some of our discussion here.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it. The first thing I want to locate is that Flintworks invited 6 artists from the global south, a term that I'm growing increasingly critical of for various reasons, but that's another podcast altogether. Um, invited 6 artists from the global south to reflect on the idea of white money, or what they call European arts funding. And this was in 2020 or 2019. And then the pandemic hit us in 2020, and we were all isolated in our own homes, and it really brought to light what it meant to be cut off from the world. The world, as we all know, was placed in a situation that we were completely alien to, and to make work about money in that time felt a bit of felt like it was a privilege as an artist, but at the same time it felt vital to make. And I'll explain why. Because when the second wave hit India of COVID-19, we had no oxygen cylinders. So if people had money, people didn't have money, the access to breath became impossible. In that kind of scenario, I started to wonder, what is my role as an artist? What does it mean to have money? What does the currency, literally, what is the currency of the 100 rupee or the 10 euro note when you're really struggling for breath? So these were the two ideas I brought to making a show called I Promise the Bearer. And the line I Promise the Bearer appears on Indian currency notes. So the state or the government, when I take a 100 rupee note, it's a promise from the state or the bank. So it's a promise that I give you when I exchange that note. So then I started to ask, in the world that was under lockdown in the pandemic, what is this a promise of? What are we promising each other? What does this currency mean when everybody is struggling for breath? And as a live performer, breath is very important to my practice. As a theater maker, I breathe. And when I came to Germany, as in the pandemic, there were half the seats in the auditorium. My entire audience was wearing masks. And I was wearing a mask every time I interacted closely with the audience. And because we had been in the digital realm for 2 years on Zoom or Instagram, being a live performer was a stark new experience. And I wanted to think about the tactility of currency notes. I want you to think of, what does it mean if I don't have a computer and I hold onto paper? What is the worth or the value of that paper? So, as part of this show, I make money on stage. I created a woodcut of fictional currency because, in my mind, real money had no value. So, I started to put fictional elements on the note, which were certain life asserting principles for me. For example, 33 on 100 is the value I put as the number of the currency, which is reservation for Indian women in parliament. So it's a fraction. You never have fraction on currency notes. So already I'm destroying the idea of the value of the numeric amount there. And I put somebody called Savitribai Phule, who's a feminist icon in India, who brought education to Indian women, rather than have Gandhi, who's very famous across the world. And I am somewhat of a critique of Gandhi and his policy for various reasons. So, what does it mean then to create this fictional element? And I give it to the audience then. And I say the promise of this currency in this charged environment where my breath can kill you and your breath can kill me is the promise of an interaction, is the promise of a gaze, a promise of a smile, a promise of if we meet somewhere in the world, whether it's on a hospital bed or a mortuary, I will look at you. I will exchange a breath no matter how dangerous it is. So it became a promise of the life that was precarious, that we will hold each other in these times of distress. So that's what I Promise the Bear, philosophically, in short, is about. But it's not a serious show. It's a playful show. It's funny, even, if I can say that. But that was the idea of creating fiction where no money can buy your life or the closeness of a loved one because we were on lockdown. My provocation was, here's my fictional currency, and I wanted to come back to something tactile. My hands were doing something on stage rather than me just looking at a screen. So these were the quick, entry points into a show. And the idea of the promise. What is this promise of? What is the currency promise?
It reminds me also, like, when you say like money as a promise, it also reminds, like, during COVID, I was personally in Germany, but my family were all in Wuhan. It was in lockdown, and a very strict lockdown that nobody can get out. And it was like, at the time, they were a lot of like kind of control on money, trying to get away from it. And also, I think another question that raised by it also was like, money used to be a note of interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And like, China has been cashless for quite a long time. Like, it's a very accelerating digitalization that happened in China, but without a very good, let's say, protection or policy mechanism that kind of protect the privacy and also protect the security in many of those digital transactions. And I think that's like your response and like your explanation of your project kind of reminds me of that time about when I talk about money as a promise. It's a promise of what they can do to you, also that not only a promise of what the government is promising you can use this currency for, but also this fiction is a form of power, that if there is no mechanism to protect people's privacy and security while using it when they become digitalized, what does that mean? So you answer my question really, really, I think already quite elaborated on like, what do you mean by money as fiction? Maybe I want to follow up a bit to Sarah. Have you ever thought about if money is fiction or not? Is that a thought or like an idea that is in your circle?
I mean, in my fintech circle, no, but in my circle, for sure, right? Also, one thing I want to say as a Nuja, what you said about your play, something that we work sounds super interesting, and what I liked about it as well is that how it's like recognizing the human, because that was lost during the pandemic. Everyone just became like an illness or something to be worried about, but that was also lovely. But yeah, no, money is totally fiction, right? In the fintech world, it's just seen as what you need, but money is fiction, but it's something a needed fiction, right? You need it. For me, yes, it's a form of control, and it can be used as some way to control people, but also you need that order as well. We used to have a barter system. This has eradicated the need for us to barter. Some cultures obviously still barter, but we as a community of society, we used to regard feathers or stones as money, and now it's gold and money. Humans will then move forward to count something else, but it's always a form of barter, and it is needed, and it always will have. With anything, people take too much control over an issue, and they take more power than is rightfully theirs. And money is just one more thing of that. You have that of water, you have that with food, you have it with everything. Money is just another thing where people become greedy and take control and use it as a mechanism to control. But on there is a plus side to it, that it allows freedom of movement. It allows people to exchange goods with other people. It allows freedom to some respects as well. There's lots of bad things, but there is good there as well, I think, and it's needed. It's a fiction, but necessary fiction, was my point.
I really like the term necessary fiction. So
Me too. Yes.
it's really interesting. Looking at it from a fintech perspective, as a user researcher, how do people in the fintech sector often approach money then? Because you
Yeah.
said that it's like this money as a fiction idea is not that often, but I know they definitely think it's necessary.
Yeah,
But
100%.
like, how do they approach it if they don't see it as a fiction? What do they see money as?
So I think also in the fintech world, money's changed, right? So in the non-fintech world, traditional banking sense, money is a tactile, it's a held thing. In the fintech world, it's digital. So it's evolved into many digital forms. So before it was just, well, not before, but what we're used to is money and gold. And now what we have now is, we have shares, we have EFTs, we have crypto, we have the different ways you can pay people. It's formed in many different ways. So it's changed what money is into some new things, and that's just going to expand and expand as we're going forward. Fintech's new. Fintech is like 10 years old, and what's going to continue to form, how it can help people, how it can take power away from the more centralized governments, take that away. Now we have Bitcoin and other interloper, we have other cryptocurrencies that are taking the power away from central banks. It will form new things going forward that we haven't imagined yet. So, what money is in the fintech world is it's removed from a tangible good into so many more things that people use to barter and people use to buy things with. And also not just that, but, buy a house, build financial wealth, intergenerational wealth. It's more than just making goods, it's about stability as well.
So, Anuja, how does the shift from physical to digital money change its symbolic and social value, especially for historically marginalized communities? Do you have some observations or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I also want to just say I really like the idea of necessary fiction. It's such a great thing to stay with, that of course it's a necessary fiction. I also think when money went digital, it becomes even more fictional, because the tangibility of holding even paper, it becomes an even more abstract idea if one were to think of it philosophically. But of course, in terms of the everyday exchange, it makes exchange easier. And also to say that the idea of digital money controlling our lives, because like you were saying in China, if I download a digital wallet app on my phone, already the government knows how much money I'm spending, who I'm spending it on. But I just wanted to say that just before the pandemic, the Indian government denotified some notes. They rendered some currency notes this overnight, which caused a lot of young and marginalized communities to suddenly have no money, because the money they had lost value overnight. And my reading at the time was that the government is obviously also funded by a lot of big corporations that run telecom industries or run UPIs, that is like online payments. And I felt like it was a move by the government to take away power from the marginalized communities even more and hand it to big corporations. So everyone was forced to use their phones or online payments, and then the lady who works in my house had no money to buy lentils, for example. So that was a kind of very sinister political move, because a lot of money just lost value overnight. But that's a whole other problem. But I think that was the beginning of the so-called digital payment revolution in India that I remember very clearly. I mean, it's been happening in India for 10 years as well. For 10 years, we've started to have digital wallets. But in 2018 or 19, there was this thing where the currency notes were invalid. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And I have a suspicion that while on the face of it we want to include marginalized communities in financial technology, and the cell phone users in India is quite high. Just before this podcast, I was doing some research, because I'm not an expert. 40% of even rural India uses smartphones. I'm struggling to see this used directly when people just don't have money. Let's say, for example, people who live off their land, people who live off natural resources. Ecology is a part of their everyday life, like tribal communities. What does that mean? how do they benefit from this digital currency? So, yes, symbolic value in numbers, in maybe trying to gain social capital for whichever government is in power, seems good. And I think at the heart of it, there might be something inclusive, but I'm struggling to understand how somebody who has nothing and lives off their land benefits. And I'm really pushing this to the other extreme, because Sarah's the expert, and I absolutely understand that it's important. And I have to say that in India, even the tuk-tuk driver, the vegetable vendor on the street who pushes the cart has UPI, has a digital wallet. So the numbers are very, very high in India already. So I think there's a paradox. I'm posing this really as my own thing that I'm trying to think through, that yes, there's a sizable population in terms of numbers, because we are such a large country that does use digital payments. The other extreme of people who live off their land, what does it really mean, where we say, the forest, the land, the whole fight is for the land, because corporations enter jungles or tribal land, and then what happens? So I'm complicating it, but I'm not able to see its direct value, and I'm really pushing it. I understand it's a necessary fiction. I totally do, pragmatically, absolutely.
I think your reflection is wonderful. This is super important points. It reminds me actually on a case that I've talked to some mates in the Interledger ecosystem as well about the current attempts of German government introducing a sort of like a payment card to the refugees and asylum seekers living in Germany. And very often, digital finances, many practices, especially introduced by big corporations and governments, present themselves as a practice of inclusion. Well, in fact, it's an invasive practice that harness people's data, take away people's right to cash, takes away people's right to decide on where to shop or not, take away people's right to remittances. And that was the case in Germany, and especially in a political context where no matter when it comes to China, when it comes to in Germany, when they are trying to kind of sell this idea of digital financial, like new digitalization for a financial system without really involving the stakeholders that are actually impacted by it and to know their opinions, their thoughts on it. What I am thinking a lot on is that I do think there is a necessity for digital financial system,
Mhm.
especially considering what benefits it, especially for people who need to have, for example, like remittances is a legitimate need for refugees. I'm only talking when it comes to my community and my localities. Like they are a legitimate need that can only be satisfied by digital financial system or digital financial application and also certain type of technologies. But how do we support those communities with their need without taking away their rights and dignity, without taking away their right to choose what to use themselves? I guess that's a very center of the question. But one thing I pick up from what you said, I think it's something that worth us investigating further, is that
Mhm.
we were talking about money as a necessary fiction, but
Mhm.
at the same time, when it moves to digital, it
Mhm.
becomes even more fictional. And
Yeah.
I wonder if that's the case. And I think my thoughts and my reflection on that is that I think in the case that you mentioned, like why governments and a certain type of industry would push for a particular type of digitalization because they benefit from them, it's because sometimes digitalization needs more infrastructure, and a certain type of technical infrastructure are very dependent on certain big corporates and certain industries and certain government facilitation. And this dependency on them is how they can benefit from them. And that's why I think that it's not necessarily becoming more fictional when we
Mhm.
only have currency as in ancient time when we are just exchanging things as a currency, but the dependency is because of the infrastructure.
Mhm.
And so not I think not necessarily becomes more fiction. it could also in certain cases becomes more material, and it's those materials that becomes the resources that people are fighting over. So I wonder what, Sarah, you might think of that also. I guess, and Anuja also asked a lot of questions and a lot of provocation to you. How would you respond to our reflections here?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. I think the first thing is that when you build new digitized financial systems for people, it needs to be bottom up and not top down. That's the first thing. A lot of the times when it's top down, you're not going to be able to build something for them that really benefits them. So that's where, again, user research, understanding the cultural needs, the day-to-day living requirements of the people really comes in handy. So when you build it, you have to build it bottom up. But then secondly, another thing that you've both been mentioning is how you lose the tangibility and money becomes a lot more fictional, and 100%, right? Once money becomes intangible and harder to manage, a lot of people find it really hard to budget. A lot of people are very used to budgeting with putting certain pots of money into certain areas, but when it's all digital, it's impossible to do. So in the UK, for example, a lot of communities are taking cash out so they can budget better. But for example, in Sweden, one of the leading fintechs there called Gimme is teaching financial literacy tools to children, because it's not taught, as you guys might not remember, but in school, we used to be taught with actual notes of, playing shop with playing coins, this coin equals this much, this coin equals this much, and what that all means. All of that knowledge of what money is being lost because it's just becoming one homogenized thing online where it becomes impossible to really understand it. So bringing back that knowledge and breaking down what money is online is also super helpful. But like I was saying before, you need to removing that top-down approach to building a new digital financial solution, and also getting rid of the idea that one size fits all. Mm-hmm. When you had cash, you had this amazing ability for people to use it in different ways, the ways that benefited them. And that needs to have the same approach when it comes to fintech and building these new financial institutions, understanding that there's many, many different segments of people and they will all use it in various different ways.
May I just follow up to ask a bit more on so maybe from a fintech perspective, what kind of technical infrastructure is needed for money to function when it becomes more digitalized? And also maybe what type of infrastructures that are sort of incoming, or what kind of technical material tools that are currently being built influence the digitalization of money, and how fictional it might seem for people, or when it could be harnessed by different, for example, corporate interests or authoritarian interests.
Yeah, so the way I see how money is moved is I think about it in terms of railway lines. So all money is moved on things called rails. So when you have steam engines, they run on a certain railway track, and it's kind of slow and it can only do so much. And then, for example, when you have the high-speed trains, they can't run on the same train as the steam trains. They have their own track, and that train is super fast and it can do so much more. And that's exactly how it is with money. These different rails operate behind the scenes that move money around. And so if you're working on something that's a steam engine train, so something like an old bank, it can't talk or connect with the fast-moving hyperspeed train because it's on a completely different network. There is no connection between the two, and they're doing very different things. So that's why when you're using your old bank app, it takes them 24 hours for that notification to come through. And with the fintech, it comes through straight away because they're working on completely different systems. And that's why there's a lack of connection sometimes between different systems, because they run on all these different networks that can't communicate because they're doing very different things. So bringing in connections that allow these older networks to talk to each other would be super helpful. Things that work across many different networks. And then also, slowly building up the railways so they're all of the same level. That's all it is. It's different rails working at different speeds with different technology, and just trying to make sure they interconnect going forward, and then they all work at the same level.
I think also this is actually what Interledger Protocol is trying to do, to build this sort of a interoperable connection and interoperable payment systems. I want to maybe go a bit deeper into this idea about even when they are interoperable, even sometimes when the technology and the infrastructure and everything has been done technically connected, it might still not be the way it is for different communities, right? Because when different people enter, let's use your train and like, let's say your train metaphor, when different people, different like train station, they notice different things. Like right now, for example, when I go into certain type of train stations, the first thing I notice how much police there is there because of the current political situation in Germany. So that's a very big thing for my current attention, and also my imaginaries about what train station stands for, what border stands for. So I guess that maybe if we think about money as a fiction, financial system also as fiction, to what extent do these imaginaries differ for different communities? Do you have any example for that?
Yeah, I mean, so, different communities, I'm going to move away from the train metaphor because it's not going to work for this, but but different communities use money differently, and also different communities have trust in different power holders differently. So, in the Western, Northern European, people trust the banks, people hold money in their banks. Other communities don't. They don't trust the banks. They don't trust the governments. They'll hold money somewhere else. Communities themselves hold the money. Communities themselves hold the power. So trying to understand that is also super important. As again, when me and Xiaoji we talked at our conference, the Interledger conference, and I highlighted one of my favorite apps, which is called Bloom Money. Well, what they do is they help communities that are used to building wealth through community building. So I don't know what they're called in South Asia, I can't remember, but they have them all around the world, where each month everyone puts in a certain amount of money, and then once a month one person gets the money out. So you don't put the money, it's community savings, right? What they've done is they digitized that. So they brought that idea of what different forms of cultural banking and saving are, and they brought it into the UK for refugees and for immigrants to have that culture of banking. So it's about understanding that, and understanding that people aren't necessarily going to invest in shares and corporations they don't know of. They're going to invest in themselves and their community. And that's also super important, understanding people's culture. But then also really language is super important. If you go onto a financial app, they will speak in a very corporate way that's very, very buttoned up. It's the bankers, it's the navy suits. People don't know that, people don't trust that, people are intimidated by that. Another one of my favorite apps is called Clio, and what they do is for Gen Zs, and they talk to people in their own language. So they're like, hey, help me budget. Hey, but you basically just type in, hey, help me budget. How much money have I spent on coffees this week? And so instead of having to go through and understand things, it's just your friend. It's where it helps you on your level, not a higher up level, not a top down, but bottom up level, to help people get to that level to build that financial trust in various different forms.
You mentioned like trust and also mentioned language. Anuja, maybe as a female artist living in India who has both worked as a grantmaker and as artist yourself, except for the barriers that Sarah has already mentioned, what do you see as the most significant barriers to financial inclusion for your communities? Or maybe are they very similar to what Sarah has mentioned, and you have more examples and elaboration you want to add on that?
I mean, of course, it overlaps with the examples Sarah has mentioned, and I think one of the biggest barriers for access to money, even before we even speak of inclusion, is if I'm writing for a grant, most times have to write in English, and many artists do not speak English in India. But many grant makers, including the organization that I worked for, is now accepting applications in as many Indian languages as possible. The second thing is you have to write. A lot of communities, the written word is not their default way of communicating. Sometimes it is just the voice. There are other methods of transactions. So, again, the grant maker that I work for now also accepts oral proposals to apply for an artistic grant, which I think is fantastic. A lot of it is also moving towards, let's say, integrating sign language, because we have to think of access of communities not just socially but also physically, communities that are excluded. So applications in braille or sign language applications and so on would be one way of streamlining this process, is what I can think of immediately to curtail these barriers. And of course, the barrier of the mind to say, can I even apply? Or this is for someone else. And again, I want to place myself in a very privileged position. Like when I'm listening to what Sarah is saying, that train metaphor is fantastic. I'm incredibly privileged to be traveling to Germany. And Xiaoxi, as you were saying about borders, I mean, I have a passport. Even though I complain about it, I have a passport. I'm able to travel. Free travel is, for the large part, available to me, and there are communities that simply cannot even travel. So I'm thinking of even more basic ways of how to include people, and a lot of funders or grant makers in the arts are now trying to integrate various ways so that communities can approach them. They also go into communities, so it's not like you just have to go to somebody's office, but they do visits to villages or rural parts of India where they talk about their work. And the other thing I really wanted to say was this idea of the fictional. Like, I'm really privileged to say that money is fiction, because those who don't have it know that it's very, very important. So I want to make a big caveat while I'm listening to this as well, that for me to say money is fiction is such a big privilege. As somebody who doesn't have any of it, and for them, it's not fiction. It's important. It is access to healthcare. It is access to clean water. It is access to education, right? People will be left out if they don't pay school fees and so on. So I just wanted to caveat this whole thing about fiction with that I can say this, but it's not. If you don't have it, is when you know how much you need it as well. So I don't know if I answered your question about how we can make it more accessible, but I would think language, physical access, differently abled people, how do they access a grant writing application, the word itself, language itself, and that's I'm building on what Sarah said already, that language itself can be exclusive.
I very much agree with what you said about the accessibility of financial systems is the accessibility of many, many other things too. That our default financial system is built upon the experiences and the norm that are experienced by the most privileged few, that including us who have passports, and also people who are able-bodied and who live largely in global north or travel frequently to the so-called global north. And I think another thing about money is fiction that's quite interesting is that I think the discussion while I was working on my last project about this emotional intangible dimension of money, I
Mhm.
noticed how easy it is for it to go into a little bit of a dangerous kind of direction, exactly as you said. For
Mm.
people who usually can philosophically kind of philosophize everything and philosophize this idea about what's the imagined aspect of certain thing, what's the social political construct of the certain thing, are very often people who do not have to think about the practical aspect of it. Otherwise, you are so preoccupied with this like survival mode, and to only think about because imaginaries are flexible and fluid and can be changed. And that is definitely one aspect of changing the lived reality and changing the materiality around things. But it's the material conditions that's very often are that has and embodied with inequalities. And if we only talk about the imaginary aspect and the fictional aspect of it, we sometimes would very easily ignore like the lived reality of the many who do not have material access to things. And that does not really create the kind of system change we actually want to see. So, Sarah, maybe what do you think about Anuja's insights here?
No, I mean, I completely agree with everything that you've said. One of the things that I was thinking about just as you were talking, Joji, is like how can we build how can we build systems going forward where you build from the bottom up, where people with the lowest amount of power are on the same equitable level? And I don't know the answer to that, because ultimately it's always going to be built with the people that have more time on their hands to be able to think of these things, right? Being able to be innovative, be creative requires time, it requires space, it requires so much freedom that only a certain type of peer person can have that. And unless you are fully aware, even if you are fully aware of the lived experiences of people, and you may have come from a less privileged background and you kind of remember that, unless you're constantly speaking to those people, unless those people's thoughts, feelings and needs are part of your research and part of your thinking as you're going forward, it's never going to be built out, because we can only think through our own mind. Even with research, you can only do as much as you can, but it always needs to be there that if you're building going forward, the customers, not the customers in this example, but the people's voice has to be there. And without that, it's never going to be pushing the barriers in any way.
May I ask Sarah a question? Because we've been thinking about fintech and the idea of digital payments. What or who, according to you, or is there even the new age digital money lender?
Oh, okay. So when it comes to money lending, I can generally only speak of Europe as my main example because that's where I'm based and that's where a lot of my fintech knowledge is. Some parts of Africa, East Africa, South Africa, and America. And India's got a massive fintech scene, so I know a lot about that. But my most experience is UK and European based. And there's been a lot of new wave digital friendly lending. The idea of credit lending beforehand being, something people were scared of. But that's because people were scared of banks as well. And the idea of taking a loan out, the idea was that you would go into debt and it was incredibly scary. Now there have been fintechs. One escapes my mind, but one's called Tangerine. Farlo is another one, where the idea is, and these Farlo, for example, one of my favorite fintechs. They're set up by two brothers who were, I think, Iraqi refugees who moved to Sweden, and they saw the negative consequences of their mother taking out a loan for their education and the dire effects it had on their mother's life, trying to repay that loan. So they have built this company trying to make sure that there is healthy loan giving, so people are able to lend money, but in a fairer way where people aren't ruptured going forward and build more stability instead of just taking out a loan. So there are trends going forward in that area about how to make it fairer and nicer for lots of people, basically.
That's super interesting to hear, because I think a sort of reverse is happening in India. A big conglomerate, again, that supports various governments in power, is now our money lenders are giving loans. And let's say, I wouldn't say the rural population, but a population that is not financially literate may not fully understand the impact of clicking a button on their phone saying loan, because it seems friendly, it seems accessible. So, I mean, also want to place this idea of the digital payments have a downside, where if there's not enough digital or financial fintech literacy, we will face dire consequences. Because I received, what are they called? Fake phone calls from people working in the government saying my phone number has been shortlisted for a crime I committed. But when my mother receives that phone call, she's panicking because she doesn't understand it. So this device that we use to communicate, to make also transactions, is, we cannot forget the mobile phone, because it is used for so many functions, like watching YouTube or communicating with me. My mother makes WhatsApp video calls to me. The lady who works in my house, in the pandemic, her child was attending school on WhatsApp. So that device of the phone becomes a device that she trusts implicitly, right? She says, oh, the education is coming from there. Of course, misinformation spreads through that as well. But one has to also be cautious of when they're clicking on like loan sharks, or there are apps that say get loan at 0.1% interest rate. That complete literacy has not happened. And it's not just educated and uneducated. My mother's educated, but she's much older. She's not used to this kind of interaction on this mobile phone. So I think while everyone also celebrates this revolution and digitizing money, there's a huge downside when we say we want to work with marginalized communities. And I want to extend that idea to say that the literacy of this, because there's a lot of criminal activity as well, and small scale, not large sums of money that are being siphoned off. Very like 100 rupees, which is like a euro and a half or whatever. So I think to also place some of this in this conversation, what does it mean? Or are we assuming that these communities, or all of us as a part of the community, are fully digitally literate?
Yeah, I think so it's two things what you're saying there. First for me is legislation, and the second is like around fraud, and like fraud in this area is just exploding around the world. But again, legislation comes to that. So for example, in the UK, we had lots of payday loans companies where basically you would take a loan out and then they would charge you like 100% interest, loads. And people would take out the money and be ruined. But then they were no longer allowed to advertise. Okay, so that was one thing. But then again, another thing, we have buy now, pay later, which, I mean, it's not new, but it's become digital. Again, that's fine if you have a stable income. But if you're on a 0-hour contract, if you might not have the same hours next month as you have now, that's not good for everyone. And unless it's good for, I think for me, the mentality is, unless it's good for everyone, it's not good for anyone. So these kind of things shouldn't be allowed unless they can support everyone. For me, it was fantastic, for Black Friday sales, I can stock up on stuff, but, that's not the case for everyone. Then also bringing it back to legislation, governments, financial institutions, the FCA, for example, in the UK, they need to take a much harder approach to understanding their customers' needs and making sure it's enforced legally. So one aspect of fraud, for example, is that a lot of the fraud actually happens on social media sites. It doesn't happen on mobile sites, but there's no legislation on the social media sites to stop them. And the legislation is only currently with the banks to make sure it doesn't happen. So there's a gap there. And unless that gap is filled, fraud's going to continue in many of these different areas. So legislation is also super important from the governments to take a strong aspect, because so much money is being lost. It's in the billions. It's ridiculous.
I think that's a very interesting aspect that you mentioned, Anuja, about the literacy, because I've debated myself like many times about like how do I think about digital literacy, media literacy work, also like financial literacy work, because I actually like when I was working with refugees and asylum seeker communities in Germany, that was part of the work I did, especially to elderly migrants who are very often less visible for basically public discourse, face a real struggle. The controversy is never centered around them. And also there's no resources that are poured on their, let's say, the integration, if people call it, even though that's not often the actual expectation. The actual expectations sometimes are assimilation, not integration. But very often I know like I'm doing this to kind of do it because we need it in the short term to support them, because it's an urgent need for them to understand those systems. But very often when I do it, I feel how much we actually need sometimes a system change. And because like I guess it's the same with thinking about financial system, if people needs to be educated to understand and to not be harmed by that system, this means there is something that is not going quite all right with that system, right? And I very often what I ask myself is that are financial systems just designed to be this way, or are there many existing conditions that make financial system the way it is today? What do you folks think about that? Do you have thoughts related to that?
I think that's a tough one, because so the banks have to make profits for their shareholders. Banks also have a duty to their customers. So it kind of depends on where that fine balance lies. For me, I'm as a user researcher and as a person who cares about people, they have to protect their customers first. And also in the more sustainable economic model, if they're not protecting their customers first, where, what's going to be happening in the long run. But I think there's been a history of predatory banking, where if, for example, you are low on cash and you go under your bank balance, you get charged a high amount. There's many aspects of like different types of predatory banking in these ways. I think, again, from the UK's example, it's kind of been faded out slowly, but not quick enough. So I think, again, for me, that comes down to legislation, trying to prevent banks from doing these things that are predatory and kind of helping people. But the FCA has updated its consumer duty, which I'm sure will mean nothing to the, but basically the idea is that it needs to protect more people in more ways, and banks need to pass on the benefits it receives from like interest rates increases quicker to its customers, instead of having a slow update of its interest rates. So kind of things like that to really make sure that banks are staying on top of things for their customers via legislation is super important.
It's a very, very good question. I'm also struggling to answer it because at one point, I do think systems per se are not bad, because as Sarah was saying at the start, that we need an organizational principle. So systems per se are not bad. Who do systems benefit is an important question for me. Who participated in creating these systems is an even more important question for me. Because it's not to say that the capitalist system is horrible, the socialist system is great, because we know there are flaws in both. And for me to say again that the system is important, but who benefits, who creates these systems? And also, I always find it exciting that people all across geographies also find ways to beat systems, because scams happen. There are big frauds that happen with big banks, and it's usually not the marginalized communities. It is another person who knows how to play the system, who's responsible. And one person who tricked the Indian banks is sitting in the UK just now, actually, the owner of a big conglomerate who lives there. So I think systems are necessary, but I would also like to offer alternate ways of doing things. For example, we also mentioned barter earlier, and what is stopping us as artists to work with a barter system, for example? Do I always need to be paid in monetary terms for a service I've given someone? And for example, really, when we did the No More White Money project, Shashi, we met in India in January 2024, and a local artist hosted 6 artists from across the world for no money. He gave us warm meals 3 times a day, and in return, we had to do theater workshops for the local community. Now, that's a great system because none of us are poor or, in a conventional sense. So we could gather in a small village outside of Bangalore and use that beautiful space to create art, but also do something in return, right? So the exchange of money never happened, but the exchange of good food, good ideas, and resources happened. So, can we also think of systems that tap into resources other than finance? And here I talk about cultural capital, social capital, because I also want to find a way to transcend these very traditional systems. While I acknowledge their importance, but I, as an artist, want to find other ways. I want to find the gaps. Not always to be an anarchist, but to find other ways of supporting work, to have conversations with my friends like this, like both of you, that enrich me without exchange of money, for example.
So I guess you kind of partly already answer a question I actually want to ask you. What role does art and culture can play in creating, removing perceptions of fictional money, and also like the view we currently have with financial systems? I think this is such a relevant discussion. Sarah, I want to ask you maybe on your view. So how does the fintech industry then views the function of money and the digital financial system in this regard? And like, how do you think fintech industry current work playing, let's say, changing the perception of money and financial system?
I think in general, for most of the fintechs maintaining the current system, there is a small movement by a few fintechs to kind of bring in the idea of emotional awareness of your spending habits and kind of connecting the idea of being more mindful of your spending in many different ways. So basically, there was one fintech called Simple, where you, after you bought something, it would ask you to rate your emotions an hour later, 6 hours later, 12 hours later, and like 3 days later to kind of basically prevent people from buying frivolous goods. And I think that's also related back to the environment. You know, you'd often buy things that are new, that were reduced, and the idea of like kind of making sure that people would like be able to take a step back and really break down, understand their emotions when it came to spending and buying things that weren't necessary, and kind of making them more aware. So that's one way some fintechs have been doing it. There's also been a few fintechs that are merging wellness and money together because the idea is, you know, if you become a bit more self-aware of yourself, your emotions, you regulate them, you become a bit more self-aware of your spending habits. It's all about budgeting in many different ways. You budget what you eat, you budget what you think, you budget what you spend on. It's all part of your whole holistic being. And there's a few apps whose names I cannot remember right now, but they'll come to me in a second, who are kind of bringing that whole idea together. These are the marginal apps. There's not a massive trend, but it is happening, and there's a small demographic. But again, it's a demographic that has had the time to be like, you know what, I need to be a bit more better in these areas. There's no survival needs here. These are people who are comfortable, who have the idea of, you know, I need to be able to do better. They're not surviving day to day. They are able to take a step back and be reflective of how they could make themselves better instead of just trying to survive on a day-to-day, week-by-week basis.
Anuja, what do you think of the current transnational global art funding system and how are they entangled with the existing financial system? Or is it too big of a question?
No, it's a question we've been thinking of collectively as the No More White Money group as well, which you saw in Berlin earlier this month. So the first thing I want to say, this Berlin arts funding crisis, I find it sometimes a little bit laughable because that's really a problem of plenty. When my friends in Germany say we don't have structural funding, I was like, how lucky you had structural funding to begin with, because I'm a full-time artist, but I'm traveling on work now I do lots of other work in order to fund my arts practice. So I'm working with a corporation just now that I cannot name in order to make a living. So I'm not sitting in this nice hotel room by myself, but I'm here on work. And simultaneously, I will write my arts pitch or write my show or work on the book that I'm working on while trying to make a living. Right? So I understand that the problem of the arts funding cut is sad for people in Germany and in Europe, but it's really a problem of plenty. There's a lot of money in the arts. My artist friends in the West can be full-time artists. I don't have the privilege to be a full-time artist. I have to do lots of other things. And to just close this idea of the transnational arts funding replicating, of course, colonial systems of funding still happen, and the structures are the same. I mean, I will still struggle to get a Schengen visa, as you saw. And I also wanted to place that, colonialism is not an old idea alone. I recently read an article, and I'll find the source and send it to you, that the European Union made 130 million euros from rejected visas from countries in Asia and Africa. From rejected visas, right? And these are people who are retirees, are pensioners, whose life's dream was to come to Europe, but the visas are rejected. So I just want to place that idea again, that money is still being taken from countries like ours and then pumped back to us saying, this is an arts grant. You should be grateful to us. I want to say, no, I'm not. Maybe it's still our money. So this is what I wanted to say. Even when I receive arts funding from a European cultural institute, I have to always pay respect or homage to their logo. The logo politics will continue. And this idea of the grace, right? I am graceful in taking that money, but I have to be ever grateful. I mean, that idea of thank you, thank you, thank you is exhausting beyond a point. Because I did say to an arts cultural funder in White Money One in 2021 that if the cultural institutions didn't give us money, arts managers won't have a job. I mean, it's their job to fund us. It's their essential job when you're an arts foundation. So how grateful do I have to be? So yeah, it absolutely mimics not just funding structures, but also colonial structures and a certain amount of power play.
And Sarah, maybe some last questions to you on how might our reflections of money and financial systems also play a role in reshaping financial system and the societal meaning of money from a fintech perspective, and also maybe from the user research perspective as your specialty.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say was, everything that we've spoken about is about how when there's been an approach by a large organization, it hasn't worked for the individual or communities or cultures that are misrepresented. So again, it's about understanding and doing your research to make sure that you understand the needs of who you're actually speaking to, and understanding all the different types of communities and cultures and histories, and understanding of money that really breaks down and goes into it. It's not a one size fits all thing at all. It's not a two size fits thing at all. It's very, very incredibly nuanced. Lots of different communities have trust issues with different banking institutions, different financial institutions for various different ways. And it's about really digging down to the nitty gritty and understanding and building up from that.
Thank you very much for your wonderful contribution. What we discussed today is almost a nature and nurture discussion of the money. Just like human beings, very often it's not as dichotomy as it is often framed. The digital and the materials are often intertwined, just like the collective imaginaries of the system and our lived realities as an individual reacting to the system that are often creating feedback loops while constantly interacting with each other. So, what do you think the definitions and functions of money, and how would you evaluate our current financial system based on your own lived reality, and how would that influence your definition on financial inclusion? Thank you very much, Anuja and Sarah, to share your answers with all of us.
Thank you for having us. Thanks very much.
Yeah, that was lovely.
That's all for today's episode. To learn more about Zhaoji, Sarah, and Anuja and their practices as artists, strategists, and researchers, which include and are not limited to technopolitics, networked social movements, border practices, and performative aspects of political memory, please follow the links provided in the description. We hope you continue to appreciate our discussions on digital financial inclusion and its worldwide impact. Thank you for listening to the fourth iteration of the Interledger Salon.